Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
Shalom, everybody. We're starting Zechariah chapter 12 this evening. And I want to point out again that Zechariah chapters 12, 13, and 14 are all one prophecy about how things will be happening at the time when Messiah actually returns and begins to take the world back. So we shouldn't let the arbitrary chapter and verse system devised by man for the convenience of locating a certain place in a text influence us to think that there is more than one prophecy involved here. We have also been doing a class session for quite a long time. This is going to change because of the enormous amount of information that's being made available to us in these last 3 chapters. Just as an instance, we're only going to get to verse 8 this evening. But remember, we're dealing with only one prophecy from this point on up to the end of the book of Zechariah, and this prophecy is all about Adonai's return and stepping in and taking over. So let's begin with chapter 12. And Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 1, a prophecy of the word of Adonai concerning Israel. Here's the message from Adonai, who stretched out the heavens, laid the foundation of the earth, and formed the spirit inside of human beings. I'm going to want us to press or impress that first phrase of this into our minds. A prophecy, the word of Adonai concerning Israel. Of all of the beginnings of chapters through the book of Zechariah up until right now, none of them have begun this way. A more direct translation would be, are you ready for this? The burden of the word of Adonai concerning Israel. We can substitute in here burden for prophecy. The word involved is ma'asah in the Hebrew, and it's not translated burden by the complete Jewish Bible, which uses the word prophecy here, obviously. The Stone Edition Tanakh also uses prophecy, but the Sinai Tanakh, the English translation of the Sinai Tanakh, uses burden. So, okay, we ask the question, why? Well, I'm about to give you too much information about this. It's TMI time. Now, depending upon the context, there are at least a dozen options for the word ma'asah to be translated into English. It can be a carrying, a lifting, a burden, load, tribute, present, elevation of the voice, song, utterance, oracle, desire, or even longing. So why then would or could burden be selected over prophecy as best carrying the thought of this particular phrase in Scripture that we're opening with. Burden gives the feeling that in the words of this prophecy, or this oracle, that the prophet is being compelled to make them known. That would be his burden. He is compelled to make them known. It would be his burden to do this regardless of whether he would prefer to do otherwise or not. This is the burden of the word of Adonai on him. Even though the prophet might not want to say these words, he is compelled to say them. I'm pounding this a little bit. Even though he prefers to do otherwise. So what follows then is interesting. This is a reminder to the reader who these words are coming from. It's a reminder to us as the readers who these words are actually coming from. Not that it's from Adonai, but it's from that Adonai who has the power and ability to see that these words get fulfilled. It's a little more intense way of looking at who the words are coming from, not just from Adonai, but coming from the Adonai who has the power and the ability to see these words get fulfilled. Because he's the one that created all things. He's the one that created everything, including the spirit that dwells within man, all of us, that gives us life. So the type of emphasis that's in the term burden here gives import that tells the reader, look at this. Look at this. What's going to be said is important. Pay attention, because it's coming from the one who has made all things. And that emphasis is given in the term of burden. So this is more than Zechariah simply giving a word of Adonai. He's laying out what he has been given as a burden to present to us. Let's go to Isaiah, please, chapter 42, verse 5. Thus says God, Adonai, who created the heavens and spread them out, who stretched out the earth and all that grows from it, who gives breath to the people on it, and spirit to those who walk in it. This is almost identical to the language that we just looked at in Zechariah. So then, let's look at a statement that Yeshua himself made having to do with the spirit that dwells within man. I want to do this because as we go through this lesson, we have our little God boxes. And our little God boxes are usually laid out in front of us like three little God boxes, and we put Adonai in one, and we put the Holy Spirit in one, and we put Messiah in one. If we're not careful, we get so involved in that's the way we do this. But we have to remember that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are a God. They are one. And we tend to have a problem of dividing Adonai into this, and the unsaved Jewish community uses this against us. How we deal with the Echad nature of God, and the reason for looking at this now is as we go on, particularly when we get to verse 8 and verse 10, we're going to see that there is a merging take place, because this Adonai here in Zechariah is also Messiah. This Adonai here in Zechariah is also Messiah. It is Messiah that is speaking these words through Zechariah. It is Messiah. Remember the words of John's Gospel? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. This is the coming Messiah, Yeshua, that is actually speaking these words to us through Zechariah. So here is an interesting statement, and it gives us some emphasis. Remember what it says in Zechariah 12:1, Adonai, Messiah, formed the Spirit inside human beings. In Luke's Gospel, and we have the situation where the president of a synagogue has a 12-year-old daughter who is dying, and he comes to where Yeshua is teaching. He gets Yeshua believing that Yeshua can heal her. But by the time Yeshua gets to this residence, the little girl has died, and the mourners are there already. And Yeshua says to them, "Don't weep. She's just asleep." And they ridiculed him, if you remember that story. So let's pick this up in Luke chapter 8, verses 54 and 55. He, that's Yeshua, took her by the hand, called out, "Little girl, get up." And her spirit returned. That's the important thing we're looking at. Her spirit returned. She stood up at once, and he directed that something be given her to eat. Her spirit returned. Yeshua could do this because he was the one that placed the Spirit inside human beings. He's the one that Zechariah is speaking of, that placed the Spirit in human beings. That's just a little rabbit trail for emphasis. I want to start us off on this prophecy with those comments that we've made up to this point. Know that the Hebrew language indicates a burden. A heavy compulsion is on the prophet to give these words. They're important from God, and the Adonai here is the Adonai that will himself affect what is being prophesied. That is Messiah, the one who placed the Spirit in human beings, is the one who gives life. There's one more comment that needs to be made. We have to notice that this word from Adonai here, Zechariah 12:1, concerns Israel. We have to keep that in mind. It concerns Israel. This prophecy is the word, or the burden of the word, and it concerns Israel. All of chapters 12, 13, and 14 deal with, as is written, Yehuda and Yerushalayim, Jews and Jerusalem. It's always Yehuda and Jerusalem. But here in verse 1, it tells us that it is Israel that is being talked about. The whole prophecy is dealing with all Israel, even though it speaks directly to Judah, the Jews, and Jerusalem. This actually reflects a view that sees a remnant emerging from the upheavals of the last days. And this particular remnant represents people from all of Israel, no matter what tribe that they might have come from originally. Today, all people of Israel, all tribes, are called Jews. It's become just a byword. And it will be some of those that are called Jews that will go through the millennium as the remnant of Israel. It says in chapter 13 that 2/3 of the Jewish population is going to be destroyed, but 1/3 will survive. These last 3 chapters are the prophecy concerning Israel, that remnant. All right? Everybody with me now? Let's go to Zechariah 12:2. I will make Jerusalem a cup that will stagger the surrounding peoples. Even Judah will be caught up in the siege against Jerusalem. That last line is taken by some to be very cryptic, but it really is pretty straightforward. Keep that in mind. Even Judah will be caught up in the siege against Jerusalem. I will make Jerusalem a cup that will stagger the surrounding people. Well, this verse isn't quite as simple as it maybe looks like, and there's a couple of reasons why. We'll begin in Daniel 12, but first I want to remind us that at the very end of Daniel 12 we had the false Messiah. We looked at that last week. In verse 11:44 it says that news came from the east and the north that will frighten him. So he moves out in great force to do away with many, and it works its way up to the point where finally he pitches his tents between the seas and the mountain of the holy glory. This mountain of the holy glory is speaking about Jerusalem. And he, the false Messiah, will come to an end there with no one to help him. And that's where we pick this up in Daniel 12:1, please. When that time comes, Michael, the great prince who champions your people, will stand up, and there will be a time of distress unparalleled between the time they became a nation and that moment. At that time your people will be delivered, everyone whose name is found written in the book. That's the book of life. When that time comes, this is a familiar statement that's going to be repeated over and over again. This is a time of distress unparalleled. It speaks of the time of Jacob's trouble. The everyone that is delivered, that is written in the book, is that 1/3 remnant that we have been talking about. We'll do some in-depth on that 1/3 remnant in 2 weeks, actually. Now, Revelation 11 defines the temple, and that temple is in Jerusalem, and there are 2 witnesses there at that temple. Throwing you a lot of information here. There are 2 witnesses there at that temple who prophesy for 1,260 days dressed in sackcloth. They have great powers. Nobody can touch them until their time is finished, but at that time when it is finished, the beast that comes out of the abyss will overcome them and kill them. And they will lie on the streets of Jerusalem for 3.5 days. And then they are raised from the dead. But I want us to think about this. Because of the depiction of Jerusalem here at this time, and this would be in those end times, in the day of the Lord, we see here how Jerusalem is defined, how Jerusalem is going to be then in the day of the Lord. So I'm going to take us into Revelation 11:8. And their dead bodies, that's these 2 witnesses, will lie on the main street of the great city whose name, and here's what we're to pay attention, to reflect its spiritual condition. This is defining the spiritual condition of Jerusalem at the time of all this is going down. Its spiritual condition is Sodom and Egypt, the city where their Lord was executed on the stake. A city whose spiritual condition will become like Sodom and Egypt at the time of the end. We can't attribute that to any other city on earth except Jerusalem. And so with this thought in mind, it's no wonder that God has decided it's time to clean house. So with that condition in mind, let's go back to Zechariah 12:2, please. I will make Jerusalem a cup that will stagger the surrounding peoples. Even Judah will be caught up in the siege against Jerusalem. We want to see where all this fits. All this fits. This whole business of Jerusalem will become a cup that will stagger the surrounding peoples. And in that statement, the word cup comes from a compound Hebrew word. The first word means bowl or basin. There's a hyphen then. And then in the masculine, there's a word that means reeling with intoxication. The word cup comes from a compound Hebrew word. First is a word that means bowl or basin, a hyphen, and then the masculine. In the masculine is a word that means reeling with intoxication. This is what defines that cup, the cup that will make the surrounding people stagger. It will be through this cup, Jerusalem, that God administers judgment to all of the surrounding peoples. Jerusalem, the capital, representing rampant demonic influence, with both sides reeling from intoxication. Can we follow that? The intoxication is because what they've absorbed into their system that is going against what God is telling them, and they're blown away with it. They're filled with it. They're intoxicated with it. And as we look at this today, we see all the people that surround Jerusalem right now are hostile towards Jerusalem, to the Jews, and their desires to capture Jerusalem. Even the world powers seem bent on clamping their influence over Jerusalem. I believe part of this whole business of the embassies being moved to Jerusalem is indicating that, even though the United States has led this. They're going to discover, these people that surround Jerusalem, when they take this on, and the nations as well, they're going to discover that they've taken on more than they bargained for. Not only will Jerusalem be involved, but Judah also. The siege will not be just against Jerusalem, but also that brings us to Judah as well, and that is talking about all of Israel, including the real estate. Those that are called Jews, regardless of their tribe, plus the real estate. In other words, the whole nation of Israel, both physical and spiritual and physical land and people, is involved in this. In fact, the brunt of the invasion will fall there. It'll fall there first in Israel, the nation. Then we'll be moving up to Jerusalem. And the complete Jewish Bible translates this, that the Jews of Judah will be caught up in the siege of Jerusalem. Well, of course they will. It's their capital. I want to give us another thought that's out there, and this is just among a few scholars, and I think this is a bad interpretation. I totally don't agree with it, but we need to know it's there. Some think that the text here that we're looking at is indicating that Judah, the Jews, will take a role against their leaders in the siege against Jerusalem. Even Judah will be caught up in the siege against Jerusalem, is what they're interpreting this out of. Reason they give is that in verses 4 coming up and 6 and 7 also coming up, in their mind give additional suggestion of tension between Jews and Jerusalem. And I frankly don't see this, and I don't think you will either, as we look at each of these verses in a few minutes. They then take this information, this supposed tension, and they couple it to Zechariah 14:14, please. Judah too will fight against Jerusalem. Terrible. And the wealth of the nations will be assembled, gold, silver, and clothing in abundance. But this Zechariah 14:14 is being translated here as Judah too will fight against Jerusalem. Just take that section out of it. They take the influence of this and add it to what they think and come away with the Jews will join in coming against Jerusalem. But I want us here and listening to consider how much of Jerusalem is being held by the enemy. I want us to stop and think about how much of Jerusalem is being held against the enemy, and that Jerusalem that's being held against the enemy is that what these Jews will have to come against, including the Temple Mount. See, they're not coming against the politics, they're coming against the land that's being held against their will by their enemy. Jews will not be coming against their capital, but against the enemy held real estate in Jerusalem. And to me, that makes a whole bunch of sense. It's Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount, particularly the Temple Mount, has got to be wiped clean. It's not just the West Bank, not just Gaza that has to be wiped clean. It's not just the rest of the Promised Land from the Euphrates River to the River of Egypt that has to be wiped clean. It's Jerusalem as well. So then, let's see where our text will take us as we go forward with this prophetic event. Zechariah 12:3, please. When that day comes, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all people. All who try to lift it will hurt themselves, and all the earth's nations will be massed against her. Wow. From a secular point of view, this doesn't make a lot of sense, that all the nations of the world would mass themselves against Jerusalem. From a secular point of view, looking at it, at individuals' thoughts, Jerusalem is a two-bit town in the Middle East. Yeah, it's a big city, but it's still a two-bit town in the Middle East. It's not a port city. It doesn't control any abundance of natural resources, such as oil. It's up in the mountains at the edge of a desert. It has no commercial value to it at all except tourism. That's all that it has to it. And so from a secular point of view, this nation's massing against it makes no real sense. From a secular point of view. That all of the nations of the earth, and that will include the USA, are going to be massed against Jerusalem. For what reason in the secular mindset? There's no logical reason to go to war over Jerusalem. There's no real financial gain. Now, this verse 3 starts with a particular phrase. The Complete Jewish Bible states it here is when that day comes. That's a clue for us that it's beyond what the secular mind is thinking. Stone Edition Tanakh says it will be on that day. NIV says on that day. When we see when that day comes or on that day, generally it introduces subject matter concerning the end days. And this phrase will occur 11 times during this final prophecy of Zechariah. This phrase is going to occur 11 times during this final prophecy of Zechariah. So we can see plainly that there's no doubt as to where to apply the subject. Jerusalem becomes a burden to all the nations, but we have to understand that it is because of spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare. Those that are secular and even maybe many of the body of Messiah haven't a clue about this. Not a clue. The cause of the war coming from the spirit realm is over who will be worshipped on the Temple Mount, the God of Israel or the God of Islam, which is why Israel as a nation, in the end, that remnant is ultimately going to come against Jerusalem, those that are occupying it, particularly the Temple Mount. These nations that Jerusalem has become a burden to will all come against her in that day or on that day, which is generally construed as the day of the Lord. Now, this is probably going to mess with some people's theology, but the day of the Lord is not just a day. The day of the Lord is not just a day. We know that it is a time period, an extended time period, relatively. We know from Daniel that the false Messiah will enter into a covenant with Israel, and I believe it is probably an indefinite covenant, but we're told as prophecy that this covenant is only going to last for 7 years before the false Messiah is brought down and Yeshua returns. I think that the day of the Lord, or the time of Jacob's trouble, or that day, however you want to identify it is, will begin with that covenant that Israel makes with the false Messiah being brought into place. We could be, let me put it that way, we could be on the edge of entering into that period right now. Of course, I've thought that for a number of years, so history will bear this out. But when that day comes, it will be the beginning of the tribulation period. And when we get to the middle of that, or 3.5 years into it, the temple is going to physically be in place, and the false Messiah will be in residence there in the temple, demanding to be worshipped there in the temple. And the abomination that causes desolation will be there. That's a statue of himself sitting next to the temple to be worshipped when he's not there physically. We not only saw that in Daniel, but we'll run into it again. Yeshua will speak of this. In fact, he spoke of this in the Olivet Discourses, which we're going to look at thoroughly very shortly. Let's take a minute, though, to read Zechariah 12:3 again. It says, "When that day comes, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who try to lift it will hurt themselves, and the earth's nations will be massed against her." Jerusalem will become what the NIV translates as an immovable rock. Stone Edition Tanakh calls it a burdensome stone. The implication is it will become an object that when the nations try to come against it, they will literally gash themselves. Our translation says, hurt themselves. It's interesting that there are a lot of Hebrew words involved that can mean cut or lacerate or gash. And this particular verb that's in play here is found only in two other places. Only in two other places throughout Scripture. The Complete Jewish Bible translates it as hurt themselves. Stone Edition Tanakh translates it as lacerated. Others grievously hurt, etc., etc., etc. But it's also used in Leviticus, where the prohibition is given for the cutting or mutilating of one's own body as a sign of mourning. That is, for those of you who want to look it up, Leviticus 19:28. It also says, don't cut gashes in your flesh when someone dies, or tattoo yourself. That's what it says. Don't cut gashes in your flesh when someone dies, or tattoo yourselves. I am Adonai. This same word is used again, still in Leviticus, this time in chapter 21, verse 5, if we can have that, please. Kohanim, that's the priests, are not to make bald spots on their heads, mar the edges of their beard, or cut gashes in their flesh. This again is this same word. And it's interesting that this same word is used in Zechariah 12:3, indicating that the nations of the earth are going to do this to themselves. They're going to gash themselves over Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be what they gash themselves on. And I don't think this is just by chance. I think it has satanic origins involved in it. That's why this whole area has become a place of intoxication, Jerusalem. Think about when Yeshua encountered the man that was filled with the legion of demons. I want to take this just a little further. Go to Mark chapter 5, 1 through 5, please. Yeshua and his Talmudim arrived at the other side of the lake in the Gerasenes territory. As soon as he disembarked, a man with an unclean spirit came out of the burial caves to meet him. He lived in the burial caves, and no one could keep him tied up, not even with a chain. He often had been chained hand and foot, but he would snap the chains and break the irons off his feet, and no one was strong enough to control him. Night and day he wandered through the graves, through the hills, howling and gashing himself with stones. Gashing himself with stones. And I think this helps us understand, presents to us a demonic dimension of this word gash, of hurting themselves, as we would apply it to Jerusalem. The nations are going to be gashing themselves on the heavy stone of Jerusalem. To gash or cut oneself is forbidden by Torah. And this is a thought that we have to consider. Spiritual warfare as to what is the driving force that would cause the nations to expend themselves against God's chosen city. And again, the secular world doesn't have a clue. Zechariah 12:4, please. When that day comes, says Adonai, I will strike all the horses with panic and the riders with madness. I will keep watch over Judah. I will strike blind all the horses of the peoples. Horses here are generally representing military capabilities. Adonai is going to control man's military capabilities throughout all of this that's going on as he returns. This is a picture, really, if we want to look at it that way, of complete confusion. It's being brought, I believe, this complete confusion to the enemies of Israel, the enemies of Israel's armies. But the people of Israel may be sort of paralyzed in their position as well. And if we think that this can't happen, we seem to be seeing that going on to some extent in the Gaza situation right now, where Israel with the massive army seems to be operating in confusion against their enemy. Yet, we have to consider that there is a blindness going to be taking place to Israel's predicament, yet at the same time God has promised to watch over Judah. The blindness that's going to be taking place amongst the combating forces that are represented in the horses is going to be something that we, I believe, are going to see. But yet, God has promised to watch over Judah, the land, in the sense of delivering from death. The phrase, "I will strike the horses with panic," echoes what is said in Deuteronomy 28, verses 28 and 29, where God is saying, if you are disobedient, here's what's going to happen to you. Adonai will strike you with insanity, blindness, and utter confusion. You will grope around at noon like a blind person in the dark, unable to find your way. We can see this, the echo of this, in "I will strike all the horses, all the armies, with blindness." Horses representing the armies of the nations coming against Jerusalem, perhaps even Israel's army, because Adonai is taking control. Taking control. It's not going to be either of those that are cause of the victory or the loss. It's Adonai himself. It was a threat of God against his people in Deuteronomy if they were disobedient to Torah. Here, the threat is extended to nations who are disobedient by attacking Jerusalem. The nations are disobeying God by moving against Jerusalem, and as we saw earlier, that includes moving against all of Israel as well. Zechariah 12:5. The leaders of Judah will say to themselves, "Those living in Jerusalem are my strength through Adonai Tzavaot, their God." The leaders of Judah will say to themselves, "Those living in Jerusalem are my strength through Adonai Tzavaot, their God." The intervention of God on behalf of Jerusalem will be a witness to the leaders of Judah, modern Israel. It will renew the leaders and the people's confidence in God. It's going to be like there's going to be a revival of sorts that will come out of this, and we'll look at this in more depth. Some people translate this, Zechariah 12:5, is that in that day Jerusalem will become a refuge for God's people. Also, if there was any strife or bitterness between Jerusalem and the rest of Israel, as some hint back in verse 2 that we looked at, this is no longer going to be the case. Everybody's going to pull together and be unified. And Adonai is the factor that brings together, unites the people. And as we progress here, we'll see that Adonai's actions by defending Jerusalem and Israel, his people, actually saving them from physical death. And there's going to be death. There is going to be death. There will be many who will turn to God because of this, and to a position that recognizes Yeshua as Messiah. That's going to come out of this. And again, we're going to do more of this on this in 2 weeks. Zechariah 12:6. When that day comes, I will make the leaders of Judah like a blazing firepan in a pile of wood, like a fiery torch among sheaves of grain. They will devour all the surrounding peoples on the right and on the left, and Jerusalem will be inhabited in her own place. Jerusalem. Jerusalem ain't going to go away. This actually points to the elimination of the Muslim Arabs. Judah will become a blazing firepan and a pile of wood, a fiery torch among the sheaves of grain. They will devour all the surrounding peoples on the right and on the left. This points to the elimination of the Muslim Arabs. This says that the Jews will be in proximity to the enemy. This is a prophecy way back then, and this is true right now today. And this will be turned into an advantage to Israel. They will become like a flaming torch among the sheaths. There's a real parallel about what is coming on that day and what happened during the time of Samson, Shimshon's. The time of Samson has a thing that's prophetic of this. Who controls Bethlehem today? Palestinians. Palestinian is merely Latin for Philistine. Everybody understand that? Palestinian is merely Latin for Philistines, who were the enemies of Israel back in Samson's day. The Israelis and the Palestinians today are living, at least physically, in a state of integration. They're right there together. And the flaming torch and the sheaves of grain spoken of here sounds like something that happened in Judges 15, 4 and 5, please. So Shimshon, that's Samson, went out and caught 300 foxes. Then he took torches, tied pairs of foxes to each other by their tails, and put a torch in the knot of each pair of tails, and he set the torches on fire and let the foxes loose in the wheat fields of the Philistines/Palestinians. In this way he burned up the harvested wheat along with the grain waiting to be harvested, and the olive orchards as well. Too many people today think that this Old Testament stories like this have no real future bearing. No. This is a picture of something that's coming. And if we think about it, we're seeing an inverse picture of this going on right now today in the Gaza incident, where the Palestinians in Gaza are burning out the fields of Israel across from them. So much going on. So much going on. This kind of destruction is here in Zechariah 12:6, when it talks about Judah becoming a flaming torch. They're going to become like the foxes with their tails on fire running through the Philistines' grain fields. So it will be with the Jews on fire for the Lord running through modern-day Palestinians. They will totally consume them. Those laying claim to Israel and Jerusalem in the name of their false god are going to be totally destroyed. And this seems to almost indicate an instantaneous fire, like spontaneous combustion. And they will devour all of the surrounding peoples on the right and on the left. Let's go to Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 9, and we're going to look at verses 18 and 19. If you're in a Christian Bible, it'll be verses 17 and 18. Verses 9 through 18 in a Jewish Bible says, "For the wickedness burns like fire. It devours briars and thorns. It sets the forest underbrush ablaze with clouds of smoke whirling upward. The anger of Adonai Tzevaot is burning up the land. The people, too, are fuel for fire. No one spares even his brother." Adonai's going to loose this. And the people, as he burns up the land, are going to be fuel for the fire. That's talking about the enemy. That's talking about those worshiping the false god that want to take over his land and his Temple Mount to worship their false god. And among them, no one's even going to spare his brother. This is going to get to be really ugly for those folks. And this is just, I believe, begun or moving towards taking place with what's going on next to Gaza. Again, time will tell. Let's then take this to Obadiah 1. There's only one chapter, verses 17 and 18. It says, "But on Mount Zion there will be a holy remnant who will escape, and the house of Jacob, Yaakov, will repossess their rightful inheritance. The house of Jacob," listen to this, verse 18, "the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame." That's talking about the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. "The house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, setting aflame and consuming the stubble, which is the house of Esau." None of the house of Esau will remain, for Adonai has spoken. If I was over there part of the house of Esau, I think I'd be considering doing some changing. Understand that, well, first let me tell you that we did a teaching on Obadiah that contains basically all of this information. If you'd like a copy, I found the CD. For those online listening, it was done on 6/18/2016, June 18th, 2016. Its title is Obadiah, Adonai's Plan Laid Out. Obadiah, Adonai's Plan Laid Out, if you want to listen to this in depth. Zechariah 12:7. Adonai will save the tents of Judah first, so that the glory of the house of David and the glory of those living in Jerusalem will not appear greater than that of Judah. Well, if we look at what's going on in Israel today, we have to note that there's a tension between Jerusalem and the rest of the land. Politics. Boy, politics in Israel, you know. You get 2 Jews, you got 3 opinions. Yeah, right? I don't want to get embroiled in this whole thing, but I want to look at one angle of it. The Orthodox, the, quote, unique religious, unquote, are largely in Jerusalem. Shabbat is kept there in Jerusalem like nowhere else. So the rest of the country has a perception that Jerusalem is different than they are. Here our passage is saying that nobody, after the Lord returns, after Messiah returns and begins to conquer, our passage is saying that nobody is going to be perceived on a different level from anybody else. Nobody. Adonai will save the tents of Judah first, so that the glory of the house of David and the glory of those living in Jerusalem will not appear greater than that of Judah. Implied in this is that the victory is God's alone, and none of those mentioned here are going to be able to take any kind of responsibility. Also, we need to keep in our minds from back in verse 1 that this is a prophecy to Israel. I think Judah here represents all of Israel, even those that went into diaspora from the northern kingdom are represented in this. See, in God's eyes, they're no different than those of the house of David that are actually living there right now. And the victory will be God's alone, Messiah's alone, and not because of any particular guarantee to Jerusalem. See, the people of Israel believe or want to believe that God is guaranteed that nothing can happen to them. Well, that's not true, because history proves that wrong. In 586 BCE, that's when Babylon was coming to invade, the people living in Israel and Jerusalem, particularly in Jerusalem, had the idea that God wouldn't let Jerusalem be destroyed because it and they were something special. See, we're special to God. Even if we get real evil and real ugly and real bad, we're still special, so he's not going to let this go away. The actual case is, he did. See, God has done and will do things for the sanctity of his own name. And when we as his people, claiming to be his people, get too evil, he'll whoop up on us. He'll whack us. In Yeshua's time, the people who lived there felt that Jerusalem was a place of the highest spiritual level that one could attain. That was actually going on in the mindset of the people of the land. Probably the reason that Yeshua spent most of his time in the Galilee was this mindset, that Jerusalem was a place of the highest spiritual level, because there was so much false theology in place in Jerusalem at that time. Here the passage is saying, no, everyone, all Israel, will be equal in the eyes of Adonai, and their treatment will be as such. Zechariah 12:8, please. When that day comes, Adonai will defend those living in Jerusalem. On that day, Even someone who stumbles will be like David. The house of David will be like God. Wrap that mind around that one. The house of David will be like God. Like the angel of Adonai before them. And that phrase, that last phrase there, the angel of Adonai before them. On that day, everyone who stumbles will be like David. Like the house of David. And like the angel of Adonai who appears before them. Keep that angel of Adonai before them. Jerusalem is going to be defended. God is going to save the tents of Israel first, but Jerusalem is going to be defended. Look at that expression, even that someone who stumbles will be like David. What did God say of David, who just messed up all the time? He's a man after my own heart. This is a picture of the whole community that's left. Each person, each member, because we're down to this remnant now, each person, each member will know a relationship with God. The remnant that will be left is going to be special. And this relationship was once thought to be just a special right or power that was bestowed on a king by a sacred rite or a ceremony, like at the time of David and other kings who ruled over Israel, but particularly David. It was felt that they had this special relationship with God given to them by a special rite. Well, David was just anointed by Samuel. All of those in that remnant that are there when God comes back and takes over, though, are going to be in this special relationship with him, equal to the relationship that David had. Go to Isaiah 55, verses 3 through 5. Open your ears and come to me. Listen well and you will live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you. The grace I assured David. What's it sound like, huh? I have given him as a witness to the peoples, a leader and a lawgiver for the peoples. You will summon a nation you do not know, and a nation that doesn't know you will run to you for the sake of Adonai your God, the Holy One of Israel, who will glorify you. Here we see the special status that God has for the Jewish people. This is reflected in even someone who stumbles will be like David. Back to Zechariah 12:8, please. When that day comes, Adonai will defend those living in Jerusalem. On that day, even someone who stumbles will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, and the angel of Adonai before them. The angel of Adonai before them in that last sentence, last phrase, is being compared to God himself. Wow. When that day comes that this prophecy is referring to, that grace that Adonai assured David will apply to everyone, even someone who has stumbled. Praise God, because who knows, we've all stumbled. The house of David will be like God. Boy, has this caused a lot of difficulty. Some translators try to soften this. Stone Edition says, in the house of David will be like a divine being. In the complete Jewish Bible, though, is absolutely accurate in its translation, because the word here in the original language is Elohim prefixed with a kaf, which means like. A kaf means alike, which means that it's saying that the house of David will be like Elohim, like God. The problem is, Elohim is the entirety of God, including the Mashiach. And that points towards getting a little too messianic, points towards you-know-who. And after all, in certain theologies, it would be impossible for a man to also be God. Yet Scripture tells us God would come as a man. The house of David is going to come to rule during this period. It will be the time of Messiah's returning. And Yeshua is of the house of David. And the house of David will be like God. And that gets way too messianic for the non-believing community. But there's another thought in this also that is really dealt with in 1 John chapter 3, please, verses 1 and 2. See what love the Father has lavished on us in letting us be called God's children. For that is what we are. And the reason the world does not know us is that it has not known Him. Dear friends, we are God's children now, and it has not yet been made clear what we will become. We do know that when He appears, that's Yeshua, we will be like Him, because we will see Him as He really is. That preaches. This, I believe, is what the new covenant is about. I believe when this happens, this is when the new covenant really kicks in. That we will have His Torah written on our hearts, and we will be so close to God that we will actually walk and speak in accordance with His will. At this time, we really will be like Yeshua. The house of David here can be what David ruled over, as well as his line of descendants. That would be all of Israel. This is very deep, very complex statement here. The house of David will be like Elohim, pointing to Yeshua. And 1 John interprets when Yeshua appears, we will be like Him. In Zechariah 12:8, is in fact talking about Yeshua, about us, if we are the ones here at that time, to further emphasize Yeshua. Remember that last line in Zechariah 12:8, like the angel of Adonai before them, like the messenger of Adonai before them. That's what an angel is, a messenger. The angel of Adonai here is speaking, I believe, of pre-incarnate Yeshua. Many times God appeared as a man in physical form, very often as a man Himself. And I think here's one that we'll all recognize, Genesis 18, 1 through 5, please. Adonai appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance to the tent during the heat of the day. He, that's Abraham, raised his eyes and looked, and there in front of him stood 3 men. On seeing them, what a major clue. He ran from the tent door to meet them, prostrated himself on the ground, and said, "My Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, please don't leave your servant." You know why he could do this? He'd seen Him before. This is not the first time he'd run into God in the form of a man. Verse 4, "Please," this is Abraham speaking, "please let me send for some water so you can wash your feet, then rest under the tree, and I will bring a piece of bread. Now that you have come to your servant, refresh yourselves before going on." "Very well," they replied, "do what you have said." Adonai appeared to Abraham. How did He appear? As one of 3 men. The one that didn't go on, but remained behind and spoke to him, verses 16 through 32, if you want to get in on that conversation. In Exodus 3:2, the angel of Adonai appeared to Moses in the burning bush. This was a message from God coming from the burning bush. Anytime the words of God are being spoken, hang on to this. Anytime the words of God are being spoken, it is Messiah speaking. In the beginning was the Word, the concept of Memra. We need to see it is Messiah that we're going to be like out of all this. That is what is being said here, like the angel of Adonai before them. When that day comes and when we see Him as He is, this is an incredibly messianic portion. And I believe if we take the time to work it through, there's so much in here that non-believing translators are forced to soften. They're forced to soften what is being said when they translate. I find it sad that learned men will fudge the Word of God rather than change their views. And we're going to look at a little bit of that going on next week as we continue to explore this chapter. We'll close with that for now and pick up next week in verse 9.